June 1998. The construction team at Hattai's Desert, located in West Usia, finished building the complex of the Defender of Usia, Stonehenge. Stonehenge, a vast anti-air railgun network, was created to intercept and destroy the oncoming fragments from Ulysses. All that is left is to construct the 8 hybrid railgun turrets and to get Stonehenge operational before July 3, 1999. This task will be easy to achieve. With a firing range of 1,200 kilometers, the nations of Usia believe that Stonehenge will be enough to take out all of the fragments from striking the surface. They were wrong.
I think this calls for a little history lesson.
On July 1998, both IAU research teams at Seals Bridge and Kimona Islands completed their monthly report based on new findings that Ulysses has a hollow interior. Data from the IAU probe and recalculations from the computer model determined that the asteroid will at first split into 2 fragments before breaking apart into smaller fragments. As a result, Ulysses will strike a much larger area of the planet's surface than had been originally predicted. Stonehenge's range, which was thought to provide sufficient coverage, would not be able to reach any fragment outside of the 1,200-kilometer radius. The updated report was announced to the public. Not only did the world learn that the asteroid would affect the entire Usian continent, the continent of Ania would also be hit by the oncoming fragments. Specifically, the nations Emeria and Estovakia. With the news disclosed, the question arose if Usia would also protect Emeria and Estovakia by upgrading Stonehenge's range in order to intercept fragments over Ania. Sadly, the FCU opted to make Stonehenge more reliable for Usia and refused to make any additional revisions to the weapon's range. This decision did not sit well with the nations of Ania, as evident by the continent-wide protests towards Usia. Now, the FCU chose not to upgrade Stonehenge because the weapon had reached the point in its development where further modifications could not be made. Even if the weapon could receive upgrades, the FCU would still be against the idea. They feared that the railguns receiving modifications would not be operational on the day when Ulysses bombards the planet. Frustrated and confronted with an extremely hopeless situation, Lord Alberto Lawrence, a descendant of the famous Amerian ruler, King Aurelius II, devised a plan. If Usia is acting offensively, then Emeria and its neighbors will act defensively. His plan was to build an underground shelter beneath Grace Maria's castle. Since castles are built to be a defensive stronghold against enemy attacks, the shelters would be capable of housing up to 200,000 civilians and foreign refugees from Usia. Also, Grace Maria Castle and the underground shelter would be flood-proof because the castle sat on top of a large hill, which means any fragments hitting the ocean and causing huge waves would not reach the top of the hill where the castle stood. But Lawrence knew that Grace Maria Castle would not be capable of housing all refugees and relocated citizens. Lawrence advocated to the royal families who owned castles that served as historical monuments to follow his refugee plan. They agreed. Also, the American government fully supported Lawrence and helped out with the relief plan by using their own naval vessels and aircraft to transport civilians away from high-impact areas, as well as transport humanitarian aid organizations to areas where they were needed. While Emeria chose to stay on the defensive, their next-door neighbors, Estovakia, decided, heck, if the FCU can build a defense weapon, we can build one too. And construction of the Estovakian anti-asteroid weapon, Chandelier, began. Chandelier was a giant fixed railgun cannon, way bigger than any of Stonehenge's turrets. The fixed railgun was constructed on top of a large iceberg that would allow the railgun to turn. In order to power each shot, Chandelier generated power via conduction of seawater. Chandelier's ammunition, Storos, was a unique shell loaded with cruise missiles. The shells would be loaded onto a conveyor belt beneath the railgun and raised into the firing chamber via elevator. Chandelier would charge the shot and fire the shell. The shell would rapidly travel to the oncoming fragment and release its payload of cruise missiles that would fly and destroy the target. Estovakia has roughly 1 year to get Chandelier operational. Back on Usia, the UTO announced its intentions to shelter any refugees after the planetfall. While Stonehenge was nearing completion, Usia and Anya made final preparations before the day arrived. The table is set. All they can do now is pray. At 3:30 p.m., Usia Eastern Standard Time, Ulysses passed through Earth's Roche limit and broke apart into two large fragments as predicted. One is headed towards Anya, the other straight for Usia. Emeria gives the emergency order for its citizens and refugees to seek shelter. They are ready. The Estovakians are unable to complete Chandelier in time due to the complexity of the weapon's design. Only part of the barrel is built. Estovakia have no weapon to defend themselves. They are a sitting duck. Back on Usia, Stonehenge is finished and fully operational. Her 8 railgun turrets go online earlier that day. The STN crew and turret operators are on standby. They prepared for this moment for 4.5 years. They wait for the fragments to enter the atmosphere. On July 8th, the Ulysses fragments began to hit the planet. Stonehenge responded with a volley of anti-asteroid rounds. For the next 2 weeks, the 8,192 supercomputers would work non-stop calculating the fragment's destined point of impact. Fragments within range headed towards metropolitan areas were given higher priority over fragments hitting unpopulated areas. If Stonehenge's operators wish to keep casualties to a minimum, they need to make every shot count. The synthesized control network has identified a fragment headed straight for a populated area. The coordinates are uploaded to one of Stonehenge's railguns. It receives the data and takes aim. The barrel is in position. The countdown begins. An explosion shakes the complex. The railgun that was about to fire goes offline. What caused the explosion? The crew quickly learned that Stonehenge was hit by an asteroid fragment. Although the railgun received no damage, the meteor obliterated the railgun's main power supply. Without power, the railgun cannot fire its ammunition. Stonehenge's crew immediately fight the fire and prevent it from spreading. Stonehenge has only 7 operational railguns left. One less railgun means more fragments are able to slip past Stonehenge and strike the planet's surface. And one of those fragments that was supposed to be taken out is headed for Aruja's capital, Farbanti. After 2 weeks of hell on Earth, Usia and Anya survived the bombardment. Emeria's capital, Gracemeria, was unharmed throughout the event. However, their trade routes and economy collapsed due to the fragments hitting some ports and cities in the western areas. Despite the setback, Emeria sustained very few casualties due to their defensive plan and was able to recover quickly. Estovakia was devastated. Their economy was in shambles. Their capital city was damaged beyond repair and soon lost its status as the nation's capital. Chaos would ensue. Emeria noticed Estovakia's situation and launched the Emerian-Estovakian reconstruction effort. The ensuing lack of government control within Estovakia resulted in armed factions taking control of various regions across the country. On Usia, Stonehenge was able to mitigate the destruction. Urban areas such as St. Ark, Comberth Harbor, and Anchorhead were unharmed. However, other areas were not so lucky. The city on the eastern side of Newfield Island was decimated. All that remains is the crater that struck the island. Erusia received the worst possible outcome from the event. At least 10 fragments landed within Erusian borders. One of those fragments struck their capital, Farbanti. The western municipal district was submerged in water. The impact from the fragment resulted in the ground the municipal district stood on to fall into the ocean. Approximately 500,000 people lost their lives. Numerous civilians that survived the planetfall lost their homes and jobs. The nations of Usia executed their plan to relocate and assist all affected civilians. Each nation agreed that they would admit a certain number of refugees based on a variety of factors, such as how badly they were affected by the fragments. Unfortunately, this would prove to be a humanitarian disaster. On April 2000, each nation had already met their quota, but there were still many refugees without food, water, and shelter. So, the other nations decided to persuade Erusia to accept more refugees. Erusia's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Frederick Updike, asserted that they already taken in 200,000 refugees. It would be impossible to accept any more refugees while managing their own recovery efforts. As a result, Erusia tightened its visa applications and closed its borders. 600,000 foreign refugees seeking sanctuary within Erusia gathered at the border. Erusia called for non-governmental organizations to relocate the refugees. Sadly, this request was ignored, and many people died or fell ill due to the makeshift camp's poor conditions. Even other Usian nations ignored the request to admit more refugees. Instead, they responded with an ultimatum. If Erusia continues to keep their borders closed, they would boycott all Erusian exports. Remaining vigilant, Erusia continues to keep their borders closed. The other countries began the boycott. This boycott worsened Erusia's already crippled economy. This would prevent them from being able to rebuild their damaged nation. Erusia finally had enough. If they were going to recover from the aftermath of Ulysses, they would have to take matters into their own hands. On the summer of 2003, Stonehenge was busy scanning the skies of Usia, making sure that any remaining fragments in Earth's orbit were destroyed before striking the surface. The UTO personnel operating the 7 railguns were unaware of the Erusian military gathering behind the rocky hills of Hatties. Erusia was going to launch a surprise invasion, and their first target is to take over the defender of the continent. Another war was about to begin.